The Georgia night was thick and heavy with humidity. Rain hammered the I-285, smearing red and blue lights across the wet asphalt. Officer Ben Carter's heart pounded, a wild drumbeat against the storm. His hand hovered over his Glock, slick with rain and sweat. The woman he'd just pulled from the black sedan stood there, soaked to the bone, eyes sharp as lightning. "Do you have any idea who I am?" she asked, calm, almost amused. He didn't. He just saw danger. And that night, under the Georgia rain, he made the biggest mistake of his career. The call that had set Ben Carter's teeth on edge had come in just after midnight. A domestic dispute that had spiraled into a knife fight. He'd been the first on the scene, the coppery scent of blood and cheap whiskey still clinging to his nostrils. He'd seen the worst of humanity in that small, run-down apartment, a grim tableau of poverty and desperation that was all too common in his precinct of Northwood, a forgotten suburb on the frayed edges of Atlanta. Now, an hour later, the adrenaline still coursed through him, a toxic cocktail of fatigue and hypervigilance. He was cruising down a dimly lit stretch of road that bordered the more affluent city of Oakhaven when the black sedan blew past him, doing at least 80 in a 55. It was a nice car, a Lexus, the kind you didn't see often in Northwood. It felt out of place, an unwelcome intrusion from a world that was not his own. A flicker of resentment, hot and quick, sparked in his chest. He hit the lights, and the wail of the siren cut through the night. The sedan pulled over, its brake lights a defiant red against the inky blackness. Ben took a deep, steadying breath, his hand resting on the reassuring weight of his firearm. He ran the plates. They came back clean, registered to an address in Oakhaven. Of course. He approached the driver's side, his maglite cutting a bright path through the darkness. The window rolled down, and he found himself looking at a black woman in her late 40s. She was impeccably dressed, her hair styled in elegant locks. There was an air of authority about her, a quiet confidence that seemed to radiate from her very being. It was the kind of confidence that Ben, in his current state, found irritating. "License and registration, ma'am," he said, his voice flat and devoid of warmth. The woman met his gaze, her eyes intelligent and discerning. "Is there a problem, officer?" "You were doing 80 in a 55. He stated, his tone accusatory. "I was?" She feigned surprise, but there was a glint of something else in her eyes, something that looked like a challenge. "I apologize, officer. I've had a long day." Her calm demeanor only served to fuel his agitation. He'd dealt with enough liars and manipulators for one night. "License and registration," he repeated, his voice sharper this time. She sighed, a sound of weary resignation, and reached for her purse. As she did, her jacket fell open, and for a fleeting second, Ben saw something that made his blood run cold. The butt of a handgun, holstered at her hip. His training kicked in, a series of pre-programmed responses honed by years of experience on the streets of Northwood. "Gun!" he yelled, his hand instinctively going for his own weapon. The woman's eyes widened in alarm. "I'm a police officer," she said, her voice steady despite the sudden turn of events. But Ben wasn't listening. He was lost in the fog of adrenaline and suspicion. He saw a black woman in a fancy car with a gun. The pieces of the puzzle, skewed by his own unexamined biases and the raw nerves of a difficult shift, fit together to form a picture of a threat. "Step out of the car now!" he commanded, his voice a guttural roar. "Officer, I am a police officer," she repeated, her voice rising in urgency. "My name is Imani Hayes. I'm the chief of police in Oakhaven." The name meant nothing to him. The title was a lie, a desperate attempt to talk her way out of a bad situation. He'd heard it all before. "Out of the car!" he yelled again, his gun now drawn and pointed at her. Tears of frustration and fury welled in her eyes. She slowly opened the car door and stepped out, her hands raised in a gesture of surrender. She was a picture of grace and dignity, even in the face of this humiliation. Ben's heart was pounding in his ears. He forced her to turn around, his hands rough as he patted her down, his touch a violation of her person and her profession. He found the holstered weapon, a standard-issue Glock, and the badge clipped to her belt. It was real. A chief's badge. The realization hit him like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of him. He stumbled back, his gun wavering in his hand. The woman, Police Chief Imani Hayes of Oak Haven, turned to face him, her eyes burning with a righteous fire. "What have you done?" she whispered, her voice a mixture of disbelief and heartbreak. The rain continued to fall, washing over them in a relentless torrent, but it couldn't cleanse the stain of what had just transpired. In the flashing red and blue lights, under the watchful eye of his own body cam, Officer Ben Carter stood frozen, the full weight of his catastrophic mistake crashing down upon him. The precipice he'd been teetering on all night had finally given way, and he was in a free fall with no idea where he would land. The silence that followed was a living thing, a suffocating presence that filled the space between them. It was broken only by the rhythmic swish of the wipers on Ben's patrol car and the distant rumble of thunder. The red and blue lights painted a surreal, pulsating mural on Chief Hayes' face, a canvas of controlled fury and profound disappointment. "My badge," she said, her voice dangerously low, each word a carefully placed stone in the wall of her composure. "And my weapon. Now." Ben's hands fumbled as he unclipped the badge and holster from her belt. They felt foreign in his grasp, heavy with the weight of his transgression. He held them out to her, an offering of shame. She took them without a word, her gaze never leaving his. In that moment he felt stripped bare, his own uniform suddenly feeling like a cheap costume. The arrival of a Northwood PD supervisor, a portly, world-weary sergeant named Miller, did little to diffuse the tension. He'd been called by a shaken Ben Carter, his voice barely a whisper over the radio. Miller took one look at the scene. The Oak Haven police chief standing drenched and disarmed on the side of the interstate, and his own officer, pale and trembling, and knew this was a storm that no one was prepared for. The drive back to the precinct was a blur for Ben. He was placed in the back of Miller's car, a de facto prisoner, while another officer was dispatched to drive his own patrol vehicle. He stared out at the rain-streaked streets of Northwood, a landscape he knew like the back of his hand, but tonight it felt alien, hostile. The familiar landmarks, the boarded-up storefronts, the flickering neon signs of the bail bond offices, the tired, stooped figures hurrying through the rain seemed to mock him, a reflection of his own inner decay. The fallout was swift and brutal. By the time the sun rose, casting a sickly gray light over the city, the incident had a name. The Stop. The body cam footage, a grainy, chaotic ballet of flashing lights and shouted commands, was the property of Internal Affairs. Ben was placed on administrative leave, his badge and gun confiscated. He was a cop without a purpose, a warrior without a weapon. The news, initially a ripple in the small pond of local law enforcement, quickly became a tidal wave. A reporter from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, tipped off by an anonymous source, broke the story. White officer forcibly removes black police chief from vehicle in tense traffic stop. The headline was a stark, brutal summary of a moment that had been anything but simple. The media descended on Northwood like a flock of vultures, their cameras and microphones eager to feast on the carcass of the story. They camped outside the precinct, they hounded Ben's neighbors, they painted a picture of him as a racist, a brute, a symbol of everything that was wrong with American policing. Meanwhile, in the pristine glass and steel headquarters of the Oak Haven Police Department, Chief Imani Hayes was navigating a different kind of storm. She was a private person, a leader who preferred to work behind the scenes, but the Stop had thrust her into a reluctant spotlight. She was inundated with calls from the mayor, from community leaders, from national news outlets. She was hailed as a hero, a symbol of grace under pressure. But she didn't feel like a hero. She felt violated, angry, and deeply, profoundly tired. Her office, with its panoramic view of the manicured lawns and stately homes of Oakhaven, felt like a cage. She replayed the incident in her mind, a never-ending loop of humiliation and rage. She saw the fear in Carter's eyes, the way his hand had trembled as he held the gun on her. She saw not a monster, but a man who was lost, a man who had been consumed by the darkness he was supposed to fight. The pressure from her own community was immense. There were calls for Carter's immediate termination, for criminal charges to be filed. They wanted justice. They wanted retribution. But Imani wasn't sure what justice looked like in this situation. Firing Carter would be easy, a satisfyingly simple solution to a complex problem. But what would it solve? What would it change? She thought of her late husband, Marcus, a detective who had been killed in the line of duty. He had been a good cop, a man who believed in the power of the badge to do good, but he had also been a black man in a predominantly white profession, and he had carried the weight of that duality with a quiet, weary strength. He had seen the fault lines in the system, the cracks in the foundation of justice. He had wanted to fix it from the inside. "You can't heal a wound by pretending it isn't there," he used to tell her. "You have to clean it out, even if it hurts." The wound that Officer Ben Carter had inflicted on her was deep, but she was starting to realize that it was just a symptom of a much larger disease, a cancer that was eating away at the very soul of law enforcement. And as she looked out at the two cities, her own prosperous Oakhaven and the struggling, forgotten Northwood, she knew that a simple bandage would not be enough. The wound needed to be cleaned out, and she was the only one who could do it. The two cities, Northwood and Oakhaven, were separated by more than just the 4 lanes of the I-285. They were two different worlds, two different Americas. Oakhaven was a picture-perfect postcard of suburban prosperity, with its sprawling mansions, manicured lawns, and top-rated schools. Northwood was its gritty, forgotten cousin, a place of cracked sidewalks, boarded-up windows, and the pervasive, cloying smell of despair. Ben Carter's world was Northwood. He lived in a small, 2-bedroom bungalow on a street where the houses were a little too close together, and the lawns were a patchwork of brown and green. He was a single father to a precocious, fiercely intelligent 16-year-old daughter named Lily. She was the reason he did everything, the anchor that kept him from being swept away by the tide of cynicism that threatened to drown him every day. His life was a relentless cycle of long shifts, sleepless nights, and the constant, gnawing worry of making ends meet. His ex-wife, a woman who had grown tired of the life of a cop's wife, sent a check every month, but it was never enough. The Northwood PD was underfunded and understaffed, and the pay was barely enough to keep his head above water. The precinct was a microcosm of the city it served. The paint was peeling, the coffee was always burnt, and the air was thick with the gallows humor of men and women who saw the worst of humanity on a daily basis. They were a tribe, a brotherhood and sisterhood forged in the crucible of shared trauma. They looked out for their own, and they had a deep-seated suspicion of outsiders, especially the suits from internal affairs and the media who were now crawling all over their city. Ben's suspension had sent a shockwave through the department. They circled the wagons, their loyalty to a fellow officer overriding any questions they might have had about the incident. They saw him as a victim, a good cop who had been caught in the crosshairs of a politically charged moment. They didn't see the fear in his eyes on the body cam footage, the tremor in his voice. They saw what they wanted to see, one of their own, under attack. Imani Hayes' world was Oakhaven. She lived in a beautiful, tastefully decorated home in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood. It was the house she had shared with her husband, Marcus, and every room was filled with his ghost. She had risen through the ranks of the Oakhaven PD, a department that was the polar opposite of Northwood's. It was well-funded, well-equipped, and had a reputation for its progressive, community-oriented policing. But for Imani, the journey had not been easy. She had been the first black woman to make sergeant, the first to make captain, and the first to be appointed chief. At every step of the way, she had to be twice as good, twice as smart, twice as tough as her white male counterparts. She had broken through glass ceilings, but she had the scars to prove it. Her husband's death had almost broken her. He had been shot and killed during a botched robbery, a senseless act of violence that had stolen the love of her life. The grief had been a physical thing, a crushing weight that had threatened to extinguish the fire in her soul. But she had found a way to channel her pain into purpose. She had dedicated her life to police reform, to building a department that was worthy of her husband's sacrifice. She had implemented de-escalation training, implicit bias workshops, and a robust community outreach program. The Oak Haven PD was a model for other departments, a shining example of what policing could be. But the stop had shattered her carefully constructed world. It was a stark, brutal reminder that the disease of prejudice and fear was not confined to the forgotten corners of places like Northwood. It could cross the interstate. It could bleed into her perfect, manicured world. The two worlds of Ben Carter and Imani Hayes had been on a collision course for a long time. They were the products of their environments, their experiences, their losses. He was a man drowning in the darkness. She was a woman trying to build a beacon of light. And now, in the aftermath of a single fateful encounter on a rain-swept highway, their worlds had not just collided. They had shattered, leaving them both to pick up the pieces and figure out what to do with what was left. The air in the small, neutral-toned conference room was thick with unspoken words. It was a room designed for mediation, a sterile, soulless space meant to strip away emotion and facilitate logic. But the emotions in the room were a palpable force, a swirling vortex of anger, shame, and confusion. It had been Imani's idea. Against the strenuous objections of her city attorney and the head of her police union, she had requested a private meeting with Officer Ben Carter. She needed to look him in the eye, to hear his voice without the filter of a formal investigation. She needed to understand the why of it all. Ben had been equally resistant. His lawyer had practically forbidden it, calling it a suicidal move. But there was a part of him, a small, flickering ember of his former self, that knew he owed her this. He had taken something from her on that roadside, something more than just her dignity. He had taken her sense of safety, her faith in the uniform they both wore, and for that, he was truly, deeply sorry. He sat across from her at the polished mahogany table, his hands clasped together so tightly that his knuckles were white. He hadn't slept in days, and the dark circles under his eyes were a testament to his torment. He looked smaller, diminished, a man hollowed out by his own actions. Imani, in contrast, was the picture of composure. She sat perfectly still, her hands resting on the table in front of her. But her eyes, those intelligent, discerning eyes, missed nothing. They took in his disheveled appearance, the tremor in his hands, the guilt that radiated from him like heat from asphalt. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, taut and uncomfortable. It was Ben who finally broke it, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Chief Hayes, I'm so sorry." The words, so inadequate, so small in the face of the chasm between them, hung in the air. Imani nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "Sorry for what, Officer Carter? For pulling me over? For pointing your gun at me? For treating me like a criminal?" Each question was a jab, a precise, calculated strike at his already fractured conscience. "For all of it," he admitted, his gaze dropping to the table. I was on edge. It had been a bad shift. I saw your gun and I reacted." "You reacted," she repeated, her voice laced with a cold, hard anger. "You saw a black woman with a gun and you reacted. Would you have reacted the same way if I had been a white woman, officer? If I had been a white man?" The question, the one he had been asking himself over and over again in the dead of night, hit him like a punch to the gut. He wanted to say yes, to defend himself, to claim that race had nothing to do with it. But he couldn't. The lie would have choked him. "I don't know," he whispered, the admission a surrender. "I honestly don't know." Imani leaned forward, her eyes boring into his. "That's the problem, officer. You don't know. You and so many others like you don't even see it. You don't see the bias that has been woven into the very fabric of your being. You don't see the fear that has been programmed into you. You just see a threat and you react." Her words were not just an accusation, they were a diagnosis. She was laying bare the sickness that he hadn't even known he had. "I'm not a racist," he said, his voice pleading. "I didn't say you were," she countered. "I'm saying you're a product of a system that is. A system that teaches you to fear people who look like me. A system that values your life more than mine." They talked for over an hour. It wasn't a conversation that led to a neat and tidy resolution. There was no sudden moment of understanding, no tearful embrace. It was raw. It was painful. It was brutally honest. He told her about his life, about Lily, about the soul-crushing despair of policing in Northwood. He didn't make excuses, but he wanted her to understand. And she, in turn, told him about Marcus, about her journey, about the weight of being a black woman in a position of power. She didn't want his pity, but she wanted him to see. When they finally stood to leave, the chasm between them was still there, but it was no longer a bottomless abyss. A fragile, tentative bridge had been built, a single thread of shared humanity in a world that seemed determined to tear them apart. As Ben walked out of the conference room and into the harsh light of day, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was a start. It was the beginning of a long and painful journey of self-examination, a journey that he knew he had to take, not just for himself, but for his daughter, and for the badge he had so deeply tarnished. The idea came to Imani in the middle of the night, a flash of clarity in the darkness of her grief and anger. She couldn't shake the image of Ben Carter's face, the raw, unguarded honesty in his eyes when he had said, "I don't know." In that moment, she had seen not a monster, but a man who was lost, a man who was blind to the world as she saw it. And she realized that if she wanted him and others like him to see, she had to show them. The next day, she did something that sent a fresh wave of shock through both Oakhaven and Northwood. She announced that she would be doing a series of ride-alongs with the Northwood PD, not as a chief, not as an investigator, but as an observer. She wanted to walk in their shoes, to breathe their air, to see the world through their eyes. The reaction was predictable. Her own department was horrified. The Northwood PD was deeply suspicious. The media went into a frenzy. But Imani was resolute. This was not a publicity stunt. This was a mission. Her first ride-along was with Sergeant Miller, the same world-weary supervisor who had been at the scene of the stop. He was a man of few words, his face a roadmap of cynicism and fatigue. He treated her with a grudging, professional courtesy, but the air in the patrol car was thick with unspoken resentment. They spent the day responding to a series of calls that were a depressing, monotonous litany of human misery. A shoplifter at a dollar store, a teenager who had overdosed on opioids, a domestic dispute that was a carbon copy of the one that had set Ben Carter on edge. It was a world away from the relative tranquility of Oakhaven, where the biggest problems were usually traffic violations and noise complaints. Imani watched, she listened, she absorbed. She saw the poverty that was a breeding ground for crime. She saw the lack of resources, the outdated equipment, the sheer, overwhelming number of calls that left the officers in a constant state of reactive crisis management. She saw the way the community viewed the police, not as protectors, but as an occupying force. The suspicion, the fear, the outright hostility was a palpable thing. The turning point came in the late afternoon. They were called to a scene where a mentally ill man was waving a baseball bat and screaming at passing cars. He was well known to the Northwood PD, a frequent flyer with a long history of minor offenses. Miller's approach was by the book. He and his partner got out of the car, their hands on their tasers, their voices loud and commanding. "Drop the bat! Get on the ground!" But the man, lost in his own private hell, only became more agitated. The situation was escalating, a powder keg waiting for a spark. Imani got out of the car. "Let me try," she said to a surprised Miller. She approached the man slowly, her hands open and visible. She didn't shout. She spoke in a low, calm voice. "What's your name?" she asked. The man stopped screaming. He looked at her, his eyes wild with fear and confusion. They're trying to get me," he stammered. "I know," she said, her voice filled with a compassion that was so genuine it was almost startling. "It must be so scary, but I'm here to help you. My name is Imani. What's yours?" "Henry," he whispered. "Henry," she repeated, her voice a soothing balm. "That's a good, strong name. Henry, I can see that you're in a lot of pain, but you're scaring people. Can you do me a favor and put the bat down so we can talk?" She continued to speak to him in that same gentle tone, her words a lifeline in the storm of his psychosis. Slowly, miraculously, he lowered the bat. He began to cry. Great, heaving sobs of a man who had been carrying an unbearable burden for too long. Imani didn't rush him. She didn't touch him. She just stood there, a beacon of calm and empathy, until the paramedics arrived. Later, as they were driving back to the precinct, Miller was uncharacteristically quiet. "How did you do that?" he finally asked, his voice filled with a grudging respect. "I saw a human being in pain," Imani replied simply. "Not a problem to be solved." The words hung in the air between them. For the first time, a glimmer of understanding, a tiny crack in the wall of his cynicism, began to appear. He was starting to see that there was another way, a different kind of policing. And as Imani looked out at the broken, beautiful, complicated city of Northwood, she felt a flicker of hope. The journey would be long and difficult, but for the first time, she felt that she was not on it alone. The four walls of Ben Carter's bungalow had become a prison. The silence, once a welcome respite from the chaos of his job, was now a deafening roar. Stripped of his badge, his gun, his very identity, he was adrift, a ghost in his own life. He tried to keep busy. He fixed the leaky faucet in the kitchen. He painted the trim on the windows. He organized the garage. But these were just distractions, temporary stays against the rising tide of his despair. At night, sleep offered no escape. He was haunted by the flashing lights of his patrol car, the feel of the rain on his skin, the look of betrayal in Imani Hayes' eyes. His daughter Lily watched him with a mixture of concern and teenage exasperation. She was a smart kid, with a sharp wit and a bullshit detector that was second to none. She had seen the news reports, she had read the comments online, and she had questions, hard questions that he didn't know how to answer. "Dad," she said one evening, as he was mindlessly flipping through the channels on the TV, "were you scared of her because she was black?" The question, so direct, so unflinching, cut through the fog of his self-pity. He looked at his daughter, at her clear, intelligent eyes, and he knew that he couldn't lie to her. I think so," he admitted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "I think a part of me was." Lily nodded, as if he had just confirmed something she already knew. "That's what they're saying online, that you have an implicit bias." "I don't even know what that means," he said, his voice defensive. "It means you have a prejudice you don't even know you have," she explained, her tone patient, as if she were tutoring him for a test. "It's like a blind spot. You don't see it, but it affects the way you see other people." They talked for a long time that night. She told him about the things she was learning in her history class, about systemic racism, about the long, painful history of the relationship between the police and the black community. She wasn't accusatory. She was just factual. She was holding up a mirror to him, and for the first time he was forced to look at his own reflection. The conversation was a turning point for Ben. It was the beginning of his unraveling, a painful, necessary process of deconstruction. He started to read, to educate himself. He went online, not to the cop forums that were filled with a toxic echo chamber of anger and resentment, but to other places, to articles and videos and personal testimonies that showed him a world he had never seen before. He saw his own actions on that night through a new lens. He saw the fear and the bias that had been so deeply ingrained in him that he hadn't even recognized it. He saw the system that had created him, a system that had trained him to see a threat where there was none, to value compliance over compassion. The more he learned, the more ashamed he became. But it was a different kind of shame than the one that had been eating away at him. This was not the shame of a man who had been caught, but the shame of a man who was finally, truly seeing himself. One afternoon, he was cleaning out his locker at the precinct, a final, humiliating ritual of his suspension. He came across a box of old photos. There was one of him and his ex-wife, young and smiling. There was one of him and his academy class, a group of fresh-faced, idealistic young men and women who had believed they could change the world. And there was one of him and his father, a retired cop, a man who had taught him everything he knew about what it meant to be a police officer. He looked at the photo of his father, a hard, proud man in his crisp blue uniform, and he saw the roots of his own bias. He remembered the casual, off-color jokes, the us versus them mentality, the subtle, unspoken message that they, the police, were the thin blue line between order and chaos, and that the chaos was always, always on the other side of the tracks, in the neighborhoods where people didn't look like them. The unraveling was painful, but it was also a liberation. The old certainties, the old prejudices, the old comfortable lies were being stripped away, and in their place, something new, something raw and vulnerable, was beginning to grow. He didn't know who he was anymore, but he knew who he didn't want to be. He didn't want to be the man in the body cam footage. He didn't want to be the man who was afraid of a woman because of the color of her skin. He didn't want to be his father. He wanted to be the man his daughter saw in him, the man she believed he could be. And for the first time in a long time, Ben Carter felt a glimmer of hope. The prison of his own making was starting to crumble, and he was finally, tentatively, beginning to see the possibility of a world beyond its walls. Imani Hayes returned to Oakhaven a changed woman. Her time in Northwood had been a baptism by fire, a stark, visceral immersion in a world she had only known through statistics and reports. She had seen the raw, unvarnished reality of policing on the other side of the interstate, and it had shaken her to her core. She could no longer retreat into the comfortable, progressive bubble of her own department. The problems of Northwood were not just Northwood's problems. They were a reflection of a systemic failure, a cancer that was metastasizing throughout the entire body of law enforcement. And she knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that she had to do something about it. The idea, when it came to her, was so radical, so audacious, that it almost seemed impossible. She proposed a joint training program between the Oakhaven and Northwood police departments. It wouldn't be the standard check-the-box, one-day seminar on diversity and inclusion. It would be a comprehensive, long-term program focused on de-escalation, community policing, and a deep, unflinching examination of implicit bias. The proposal was met with a firestorm of resistance. The Oakhaven City Council was aghast. Why should their taxpayers foot the bill to train officers from a different city? The Oakhaven Police Union was furious. Their officers were already the best trained in the state. They didn't need to be subjected to this politically correct nonsense. The resistance from Northwood was even more fierce. The rank-and-file officers saw it as an insult, a condescending attempt by the rich, liberal city next door to tell them how to do their jobs. They were proud, they were insular, and they were deeply suspicious of anything that came from the outside. But Imani was relentless. She lobbied the mayors, she met with community leaders, she went on a media blitz, making her case with a passion and eloquence that was impossible to ignore. She framed it not as a problem of bad cops, but as a problem of a broken system. "We are all in this together," she said at a packed town hall meeting in Oakhaven. "The problems of Northwood will not stay in Northwood. They will spill over. They will infect us all. We cannot build a wall high enough to keep out the consequences of our indifference. We must build a bridge." The metaphor of the bridge became her rallying cry. It was a powerful, resonant image that captured the imagination of a public that was tired of the division and the anger. The tide of public opinion began to turn. The biggest battle, however, was with the Northwood PD itself. The officers were dug in, their heels firmly planted in the ground of their resentment. The union was a formidable obstacle, a bastion of old-school, traditional policing that saw Imani's proposal as a direct threat to their way of life. The decisive moment came at a contentious meeting with the Northwood Police Union. The room was filled with angry uniformed officers, their arms crossed, their faces set in a mask of defiance. Imani stood before them, not as a chief, not as an outsider, but as a fellow cop. She didn't talk about statistics or theories. She talked about the human cost of their broken system. She talked about the good cops who were being burned out and broken by a job that was becoming impossible to do. She talked about the communities that were living in fear, not just of the criminals, but of the police who were supposed to protect them. And then she told them about her husband. She told them about the man he was, the cop he had been, the dream he had had of a better, more just world. Her voice, for the first time, cracked with emotion. The grief, so long held in check, poured out of her, a raw, powerful torrent of love and loss. "My husband died for this badge," she said, her voice a tear-choked whisper. "He believed in what it stood for. He believed in us. Are we going to let his sacrifice and the sacrifice of so many others like him be in vain? Are we going to let this profession, this noble, honorable profession, be defined by our failures? Or are we going to find the courage to be better?" The room was silent. The anger had dissipated, replaced by a quiet, somber respect. She had reached them, not by appealing to their heads, but to their hearts. She had reminded them of the ideals that had drawn them to the badge in the first place. The battle was far from over, but in that moment, in that room full of hardened, cynical cops, Imani Hayes had built the first crucial span of her bridge. She had given them a glimpse of a different future, a future where they could be not just warriors, but guardians, not just enforcers of the law, but builders of a more just and compassionate world. Ben Carter had been following the news of Chief Hayes's proposed training program with a growing sense of awe. He watched her on TV, a solitary, courageous figure standing against a storm of opposition, and he felt a profound sense of shame. While he had been hiding in the shadows of his own despair, she had been out in the light, fighting for a better world. He knew he had to do something. He couldn't stand by and let her fight this battle alone. He was the reason for all of this, the catalyst for this moment of crisis and opportunity. He had a responsibility to be a part of the solution. The Northwood City Council had scheduled a final public hearing on the joint training program. It was expected to be a contentious, ugly affair. The opponents of the program were planning to show up in force, to shout it down, to kill it once and for all. Ben knew he had to be there. He had to speak. The thought terrified him. He was a pariah, a disgrace. What could he possibly say that anyone would want to hear? He talked to Lily about it. "You have to do it, Dad," she said, her voice filled with a fierce, unwavering belief in him. "You have to tell them what you've learned. You have to tell them your story." Her words gave him the courage he needed. He spent the next few days writing and rewriting a speech, pouring out all the pain, the shame, and the dawning, fragile hope of his journey of the past few weeks. The night of the city council meeting, the auditorium was packed. The air was thick with tension, a combustible mixture of anger and anticipation. The opponents of the program, a vocal, angry mob, held up signs and chanted slogans. The supporters, a smaller, more subdued group, looked on with a mixture of hope and trepidation. When Ben Carter's name was called, a murmur went through the crowd. People pointed and whispered. He walked to the podium, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked out at the sea of hostile faces, and for a moment, he thought he was going to be sick. But then he saw her. Imani Hayes was sitting in the front row, her expression calm and composed. She looked at him, and in her eyes he saw not judgment, but a quiet, steady encouragement. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. He took a deep breath and began to speak. "My name is Ben Carter," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "I'm a police officer with the Northwood PD, or at least I was." He didn't read from his prepared speech. He spoke from the heart. He told them about the night of the stop. He didn't make excuses. He didn't ask for pity. He owned his actions, his fear, his bias. "I was wrong," he said, his voice growing stronger, more confident. "I was wrong because I saw a threat instead of a human being. I was wrong because I let my fear and my prejudice get the better of me. And I am here tonight to say that I am sorry. I am sorry to Chief Hayes, and I am sorry to this community for failing to live up to the oath I took to protect and serve." He went on to talk about what he had learned, about his own painful, necessary unraveling. He talked about the system that had shaped him, a system that was failing not just the community, but the police officers themselves. "Chief Hayes's proposal is not an attack on us," he said, his voice ringing with a newfound conviction. "It's a lifeline. It's a chance for us to be better, to be the kind of police department this city deserves. It's a chance for us to build a bridge, not just with Oak Haven, but with our own community. A bridge of trust, of understanding, of mutual respect." He finished his speech and stood there, his words hanging in the stunned silence of the auditorium. And then, something remarkable happened. A single person in the back started to clap, then another and another. Soon, the entire room was filled with a thunderous, standing ovation. The opponents of the program were silenced, their anger and hatred washed away by the raw, honest power of Ben Carter's testimony. He had done more than just give a speech. He had shown them a path forward. He had shown them the possibility of redemption, of change, of a new beginning. Later that night, as the meeting was breaking up, Imani found him in the hallway. "That was the bravest thing I have ever seen," she said, her voice filled with a genuine, heartfelt admiration. "It was the least I could do," he replied, a sense of peace settling over him for the first time in weeks. In that moment, they were no longer adversaries. They were not a white cop and a black chief. They were two people who had been thrown together by a crisis and had found, in the wreckage, a common purpose. They were an unexpected, unlikely, and powerful alliance. And they were ready, together, to face the challenges ahead. The city council, moved by Ben Carter's courageous testimony, had approved the joint training program. A fragile sense of optimism had begun to permeate the two cities. The bridge, once a distant, impossible dream, was starting to become a reality. But just as the first training sessions were about to begin, a new piece of evidence emerged, a piece of evidence that would recontextualize everything, that would turn the story of the stop on its head. It came from an anonymous source, a man who had been a passenger in a car that had been driving past the scene of the incident. He had filmed it on his phone, and his video, unlike the body cam footage, offered a wider, more comprehensive view of the scene. The video was grainy, shot from a distance, but it showed one thing with a chilling clarity. Just before Ben Carter had pulled Imani Hayes from her car, another figure, a man in a dark hoodie, had been standing on the side of the road, just out of the frame of Carter's body cam. The man had made a sudden, furtive movement, a movement that looked like he was reaching for a weapon. It was this movement, this perceived threat, that had sent Carter over the edge. He hadn't been reacting to Imani Hayes. He had been reacting to the man in the hoodie. The video was a bombshell. It didn't excuse Carter's actions, but it explained them. It didn't erase his bias, but it showed that his fear in that moment had been real. An investigation was immediately launched. The man in the hoodie was identified as a disgraced former Oak Haven police officer named Frank Rizzo. He had been fired by Imani Hayes 2 years earlier for excessive force and a pattern of racist behavior. He had been a vocal, bitter critic of her reforms, a man who saw her as a threat to the old way of doing things. The pieces of the puzzle started to come together. Rizzo, consumed by a desire for revenge, had been stalking Imani. He had followed her that night, and when he saw her being pulled over, he had seen his chance. He had intentionally created a situation that he knew would escalate, a situation that would ruin both Carter and Hayes, and in doing so, discredit everything that Hayes was trying to build. The revelation sent a new shockwave through the two cities. The story was no longer about a bad cop and a wronged chief. It was a story about a manipulative, vengeful man who had exploited the fault lines of a broken system for his own twisted purposes. Frank Rizzo was arrested and charged with a litany of crimes, including menacing and reckless endangerment. The media, which had once vilified Ben Carter, now painted him as a tragic, flawed hero, a man who had been a pawn in a much larger game. For Ben and Imani, the news was a complex, emotionally fraught revelation. Ben felt a sense of vindication, but it was a hollow victory. The video didn't change the fact that he had a bias, that he had been too quick to see a threat where there was none. For Imani, the news was a confirmation of her deepest fears. It was a stark reminder that the biggest threat to police reform was not from the outside, but from within. It was from the Frank Rizzos of the world, the men who clung to the old ways, who resisted change with a venomous, destructive fury. The twist, as shocking and as satisfying as it was, did not solve the underlying problems. It did not erase the systemic issues that had created a man like Frank Rizzo or a situation like The Stop. But what it did do was to bring Ben Carter and Imani Hayes even closer together. They were no longer just allies in a professional sense. They were partners, bound by a shared trauma, a shared understanding of the complexities and the dangers of the world they inhabited. They met in the same sterile conference room where they had had their first reluctant conversation. But this time the air was not filled with tension and anger. It was filled with a quiet, somber sense of purpose. "This doesn't change anything," Imani said, her voice firm, resolute. "It just makes the work we have to do even more important." Ben nodded, his gaze steady, his resolve hardened. "I know," he said, "and I'm with you, all the way." The bridge they had been building was no longer just a metaphor. It was a necessity, a fortress against the darkness that threatened to consume them all. And as they looked at each other across the polished mahogany table, they knew that they would walk across that bridge together into a future that was uncertain but not without hope. The sun rose on a new day in Northwood and Oakhaven, but it was not the same sun that had set the day before. The revelation of Frank Rizzo's treachery had washed over the two cities like a cleansing rain, clearing the air of the toxic fog of accusation and recrimination. The joint training program, which had once been a source of such bitter controversy, was now a symbol of hope and unity. The first session was held in the same Northwood Community Center that had been the site of the contentious city council meeting. But this time the room was not filled with anger and division. It was filled with a quiet, nervous anticipation. The officers from Northwood and Oakhaven sat side by side, their blue uniforms a sea of unity. There was still a sense of awkwardness, of uncertainty, but the wall of hostility had been broken down. Imani Hayes and Ben Carter stood before them, not as chiefs or suspended officers, but as leaders, as partners, as survivors. They told their story, the whole story, from the rain-swept highway to the shocking revelation of Rizzo's betrayal. They spoke with a raw, unflinching honesty that held the room in a captivated silence. "This is not just about training," Imani said, her voice ringing with a passionate conviction. "This is about changing the culture of policing. It's about remembering why we took this oath in the first place. It's about building a future where an incident like The Stop can never happen again." Ben Carter, reinstated to the Northwood PD but a profoundly changed man, spoke next. "I stand before you as a cautionary tale," he said, his voice filled with a humble, hard-won wisdom. "I was a good cop who made a terrible mistake. I was blind, but now I see. And I promise you I will spend the rest of my career helping others to see as well. The training program was a revelation. It was not a lecture, it was a conversation. It was a safe space for officers to talk about their fears, their biases, their frustrations. They engaged in role-playing exercises, they listened to the stories of community members who had been victims of police misconduct. They learned new techniques for de-escalation and communication. The change was not instantaneous, it was not a miracle. It was a slow, difficult, and often painful process. But it was real. The officers from Northwood began to see the community not as the enemy, but as their partners. The officers from Oak Haven began to understand the pressures and the challenges of policing in a city that was not their own. The bridge was being built. One conversation, one interaction, one act of compassion at a time. A few months later, Imani and Ben stood on the actual bridge that connected Northwood and Oak Haven. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over the two cities. They were no longer two separate worlds, but two communities that were starting to find a common ground. "You know," Ben said, a small, wry smile on his face, "I used to hate this view. All I could see was the difference, the distance." "And now?" Imani asked. "Now," he said, his gaze meeting hers, "all I see is the connection." They stood there in a comfortable silence, two unlikely friends who had been forged in the crucible of a crisis. They had been to the brink and back, and they had emerged, not unscathed, but stronger, wiser, and more hopeful. The journey ahead was still long, the work was far from over, but as they looked out at the horizon, at the endless, beautiful, complicated tapestry of the world they had sworn to protect, they knew that they were on the right path. They were no longer just police officers, they were bridge builders, and in a world that was so determined to tear itself apart, there was no nobler, no more important work to be done. The profound life lesson echoed in the quiet twilight. True strength is not in the absence of flaws, but in the courage to confront them, to learn from them, and to use that knowledge to build a better world, not just for ourselves, but for everyone. In the end, this story isn't just about justice, it's about resilience, compassion, and the power of human connection. Even in our darkest hours, there's always a way to rise, to heal, to forgive, and to grow. Chief Imani Hayes and Officer Ben Carter showed us that it's never too late to face the truth, to challenge our own biases, and to build bridges where walls once stood. Their courage didn't just change a community, it changed them. A story like this reminds us, redemption is real if you're brave enough to seek it. If this story touched you, don't forget to like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more powerful stories of hope, courage, and second chances. Let's keep the light going, one story at a time.